One thing you've always said to me, which has been a big lesson, is, I need to tell you this. Whenever you have to tell me something, I need to tell you this. And then I always think about that story where they said, I need to tell you about this person. I need to tell you about this life. I need to tell you about the love I had. You
Yeah.
know,
Living with traditional peoples in Africa and Mexico and even Alaska, I've come to appreciate the oral tradition, which is that people speak of things that happen around them openly and honestly. So the phrase, I need to tell you, was born of that, really. People whose child has died and they come together for a funeral, people want to know what happened. And instead of hiding it, or, you know, it became incorporated into my first experience with funerals, which was in Africa, where people would tell the tale of the death at the time of the internment of the body, publicly.
I need to tell you this. Little did I know when I created the exhibition Passing Through that it would be more than just a solitary experience. What happened was we shared, as artists, with each other, our insights, and this confirmed my belief that art is healing, that through the process of the creative process, one can solve some pretty amazingly difficult problems. Looking at grief and talking about grief, when there is some sort of loss, there needs to be a place to express that. I've worked that out through my own creative process and found that words and artwork were really powerful for me to get through that, and it really helped me to be able to analyze my place in grief and what grief meant. I wanted to do a show of my own work, but I found that there were other people that have other interesting ways of putting out the word about loss and life, and that there's an integration of those two things. So somebody had introduced me, Terry Butler, a student of mine, had introduced me to Diana Lynn and sent me a video. Her work was really strong and really fit in another way parallel to the kind of work that I was producing. And then I realized that I had other friends that were doing similar work, and I'd asked a variety of people to join me. And then all of a sudden it seemed that this really picked up, and that it was really cohesive about looking at ceramics, photography, the type of photography and installation that Diana does, and so forth. That this is going to, that this would make a powerful show, and then after I put it up, it indeed is a powerful show. It's like we're here for a moment, and we don't know what our passage of time is going to be. We're born, we have a life, we die, and it happens to everybody. That no one is, relinquished of that passage. And so, looking at Diana's work and looking at my other artists' work, I saw that there was a connection there with the same kind of ideas about life being connected to death. That it wasn't separate, and that in grief, the way to get through grief is to embrace love and life and the things that are alive in the world and of being in the world. And so I thought, you can't, I really want to be able to put together a show that does show the hardship of that, but also shows the light of it, like the getting through the tunnel, so to speak, or going through the underworld to get to the upper world where the light is. I Googled grief and then went to the images area, and all the images are like this. Well, we're doing this.
Okay.
We're going, take your hands off your face for a minute, because we want to see what that looks like.
Yeah.
We're willing to look in the mirror, we're willing to talk about it and see where that, if it gives us information, so that when we get there, or you get there at a difficult moment, you'll have something to go on.
Yeah.
I need to tell you. I lost my son 8 years ago. When that happened, it threw me into the most incredibly devastated state that I'd ever been in. And I'd been in some hard times in my life. But this was beyond any kind of reason, beyond any kind of logic or understanding, that I was now in a place that my son didn't exist, which meant every molecule of my body, everything that I came in contact with, every object, every desire, every feeling, everything that I had around me no longer contained the thing that I loved. And you search and you inventory and you go mad and you scrape and you scratch and you dig, and it's not there, no matter what.
The madness, it's normal. It's normal, considering. Not long after my son died, I went to my friends, Wayne and Jeannie, and I asked them if I could float Nanda's blanket down their river.
I remember the first time somebody said, "Oh, making art must be really healing for you," and I took offense to that. I'm like, this is not about self-healing. When much later I realized it wasn't about self-healing, but it was self-healing. It was really about processing ideas around death and the expression of death and the fear of loss and the loss and every aspect of it that's really monumental, and being able to make it in a form that you could show to somebody else and say, can you feel that? This is what I feel. Can you feel that? And instead of, oh, I made this thing and it made me feel good, so I don't really need to share it with anybody necessarily, except that, oh, this made me feel good. It never made me feel good necessarily. In fact, when I was doing some of my work, it made me feel bad. I had to stop mid-point and go, I need to give this a rest, because this is not healing to do this act, but it is a sort of but it's my gift of investigating and being able to bring back from this underworld this fruit that's going to be full of knowledge, not like the bear of like Persephone or anything, but it feels like that. It feels like, look what I discovered here. It's like, I know more about myself, and it's opened up my being able to look at flowers open up, or being able to converse with somebody and know this might be the last time I converse with them. There's a certain importance around life that starts to be acknowledged when you dig into the dark, dark places. I mean, it's a very interesting, and it feels like, why would anybody want to go there? That's why, because there's some knowledge there that really is important to know about.
Yeah.
When is making art an opportunity to escape reality? And when is art an opportunity to deal with a reality that is too big to deal with any other way?
My friend Colleen taught me that you need to have an intent, and then find a place and a time, and then let the creative process take over. You can follow that, and it'll take you to the answer you need to know. It can really take you to the deep places that are meaningful and insightful.
I stopped making artwork, or at least I thought I had stopped making artwork. And a friend of mine said, gosh, your journal entries are really interesting, and the photographs that you're doing, they're also quite interesting. I said, they're just journal entries. I'm just trying to understand where I am, my belonging here, my sense of knowing what it is I have to deal with now. And it's such a tremendous question, facing that kind of loss. And then at one point I looked at it and I said, I could actually do this with intent. I can create a space, have an intent, and really follow through with, what does grief look like? How am I going to grieve? What is it that grief is? And I remember reading a passage written by somebody, I can't remember the author, that said, how do we grieve? Awkward at best. And so there really isn't, I couldn't find in this culture any way to talk about it, or I went to grief groups, I read books, and it just wasn't happening. It wasn't really getting to the power of it.
I really understand Demeter. In the story about Persephone going to the underworld, Persephone gets taken away, and Demeter, her mother, goes into this horrible grief. And she gets so frozen that she freezes the entire world. And that's what happens. 3 months before my son died, I photographed him. Then I went back to that same place a year later and photographed myself in his clothing to look at that place again, because I was so frozen in time. But when I looked at the photograph, things had changed. The bougainvillea had died. The stepping stones had moved. And he was gone.
That was the first painting I had done, the pomegranate with a bone. So the pomegranate became this thing that I held on to through this whole grief process. When I finished that painting, the only thing that would have had much color was the arm and the pomegranate. It's the only thing that had life. It was the only thing that I was hanging on to. That was a deep grief painting of being pulled down.
So it's a symbol of like just having the last bit and you're under,
Yeah.
but you've got one arm
Yeah,
out of
exactly.
the river of death.
What Persephone did was she brought a pomegranate from the underworld, sort of like a gift, a symbol to bring life and death together, to show that they're not disconnected. They go hand in hand. Like birth and death go hand in hand. It's like this cycle. Diana Lynn puts birth next to death.
Like most good ideas for me creatively, I was in the shower and I just went, oh, birth and death. That's a no-brainer. And by putting the birth in there, I think it was a way of saying to people who would look at the work, look, you know, you're born and you die. You're born and you die. Quit denying half of it.
Wayne left a message on my machine. And this was a couple days after the anniversary of my son's death. It had been 8 years. And I called him back. And he told me, Jeannie is gone.
I have a very young person with us tonight. Wayne is 11 months old. He'll explain that to you.
11 months ago tomorrow, my wife Jeannie died. That event triggered my personal experience of grief that is the subject of my photographs in this show. I witnessed my wife looking her death directly in the eye with tremendous courage. And I'd like to tell you something of Jeannie's courage in facing her own death. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer less than a month after we'd run a 5K race together up in Nevada City, California. And on the day of the race, she said she wasn't sure that she was going to run. She really wasn't feeling that well. But we went to the race. You know, I started running, and she was there with her dog, Sam, who's in one of the photographs, on a leash. And he took off after me, as he does in all of our runs. And so there she was with him on the leash, being dragged by him. And so she just started running and ended up enjoying it, running through the fall colors up in Nevada City. About 2 weeks later, I took her to the ER because of some persistent diarrhea she was experiencing. And they ran a battery of tests and kept her overnight. The MRI they did of her abdomen revealed tumors on her pancreas and liver. And as the events swirled around us, including a biopsy, we were soon in the oncologist's office, where he told us that she had incurable, inoperable, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and that she was eligible for hospice that day. He tried to convince her to begin a treatment of radiation and chemotherapy, which he thought might give her a couple more months, in addition to the 6 months that he thought she would live. She asked him if there was any change in the prognosis of this disease from the time that she was working as an ICU nurse at UC San Francisco 25 years earlier. And he said no. And I knew then that she wouldn't take any treatment. On our way home, she told our son Luke and myself that she wasn't going to take anything. Not because she was rejecting life, but because she was accepting what was. She was prepared to die and wanted to be present and mindful in her remaining time. 2 weeks later, she died at home in our bed, looking out on the wood she loved so much in the home we had made together.
if such a thing is possible, she had a beautiful death, surrounded in love, dying peacefully, without suffering, in my arms, in our son's arms, with dear friends around us. She had told our son 2 days before that she was dying, that she loved him, and she asked him if there was anything he needed to know from her, anything. And he said, "Oh, Mom, there's so much. What about marriage? What about kids?" And she looked at him and said, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'll be there for that. What about anything in the past that you need to know?" And he said, "Nothing." She and I had a similar conversation during that 2 weeks. And I can honestly say, by the time she died, we had no unfinished business between us. And I know how rare that is, and how grateful I am to be able to say that. It was a display of her courage in the face of death that motivated me to face my own loss directly, to examine grief deeply, and to talk openly about it. Following her courageous lead, I was driven to make the images you see here, to pursue the basic question, what does grief look like? I chose black and white because I think it accurately carries the darkness I still live in. I know that death comes in many forms and that many of you in this room have personal knowledge of a loved one passing through in different ways. Some of you did not even have the 2 weeks to be with your loved one that I did. But no matter how you have encountered death, we all grieve. No one escapes. And I know now how powerful an emotion this is. In its cyclic nature, there is no relief, only temporary respite from grief. And when it comes back, often unexpectedly, it can bring you to your knees. For me, that has included a variety of episodes and continues to unfold. This is what I realize I've tried to portray in my photographs, even though it wasn't a conscious thing. I simply took the photographs over time, and they have revealed to me many elements about my grieving. The initial period of chaos was particularly numbing, with everything being out of focus, a disorienting blur where the world was whirling. And after sharing a life for over 40 years, a loneliness settled in that I thought I would never know. Initially, I fought it, searching for her, as in the photograph titled "The Woods." I now realize that this is a time for me to explore solitude, to understand that in this world, in the end, we're all alone. The reality of coming home to an empty house is devastating, especially when you see the artifacts of a life, a shared life, all around you. There have been suicidal thoughts, something addressed in the photos at my own hand. This grief has forced me to look at myself anew. As for so long, it was Wayne and Jeannie, Jeannie and Wayne. Indeed, the village we lived in Central Africa was called Edengeni. And our friends would laugh at us being connected at the hip, so when we traveled, they would say, "Look, it's Jane and Weenie from Edengeni." Now it's no longer Wayne and Jeannie, or Jeannie and Wayne, or Jane and Weenie, but myself and my camera, the subject of the photo, mirrored truth. For I've lost my muse, the person I discussed all the major decisions of my life with for 40 years. The truth of that takes time to internalize, to really understand, and I struggle with it still.
Colleen also told me something that I already knew. She said, you need to face into it. And I had done that. Just go in. Just go into it.
When the tragedy of my son David's death struck our family, the shock brought everything in our lives to a halt. Suddenly, our reality changed to what I remember calling, this is a mean reality. This is a very mean reality, and there isn't any way I can change it. As I've stated, the significance of events in my life had always found their way into my art, enough so that I had become a believer that art reflects what's going on inside. But this one was different. Rather than making art as a means of expression and exploration, it had actually become that which I was most afraid of. I knew it would tell the truth of this mean reality, and so I avoided the studio for weeks and even months. I avoided it because I knew that the only honest piece possible would be an image that had stayed in my mind since the beginning of this trauma. At that time, my daughters and I flew to Rome to retrieve David's body and bring him home. And it was then that I was able to go to St. Peter's Basilica and see Michelangelo's Pieta, that beautiful marble image of Mary holding Jesus in her arms. I couldn't bear the thought of probable feelings that would come with making that image. But finally, I told myself, if there is anything to this working honestly, from real life, from a truth within, I had better face into it or quit making art altogether. Making the first Pieta, even though a very small one, was hard due to the grief, but also because it was an admittance that this is what is really happening right now. It was as though I could no longer put off the truth of this new, mean reality. I had to agree to accept it. And so the images started to flow. And along with many other Pietas, some considerably larger, came further pieces that expressed the grief of that loss. There's the agony of my daughters and myself bringing David's coffin and body home from Rome. An unbelievable experience. You can't believe it's happening when it's happening. Like your ashes, you can't believe it. Then there's also the receivings of his belongings, and then those from my deep question, why? Why has this happened? These were all revealed in the making of my art. I might add here that if you are ever fortunate enough to go to St. Peter's in Rome and see Michelangelo's Pieta, or I'm sure you're all familiar with the image anyway, I was fortunate that someone had pointed out to me something to look for. And that is that although Mary appears to be completely focused on Jesus in her arm, in her right arm, her left hand is reaching out and up. And that the interpretation of that is that she is asking, why? So these pieces that are in the center here, around the Pieta, are the why pieces. And I've tried to, I have expressed that feeling. Now, 10 years later, my making art shows me that I'm still dealing with death, but on my own personal level. There is the mystery of it all, of course, trying to find all the literature that I could at that time from Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, along with the speculations of other devoted scholars. I've become somewhat of a collector of this literature. I've tried to learn from this wisdom, and now, at my age, know that another moment of honesty is presenting itself. And this is the truth of my own inevitable death. What can I possibly do to prepare myself as fully as possible? What happens between this lifetime and the next lifetime? Is there a next lifetime? Is there really consciousness between lifetimes? Of course, there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek in this exploration. I do believe that all of this is true, at least I hope it is. But I also know the limitations of my mind's ability to take it in and to live through this, or to really know. So, the most recent sculptures are called the Bardo series. The Bardo is a name given to that period between two lifetimes, often thought of as a 49-day period, called the Bardo by Buddhists. These are my attempts to face into this mysterious but also impending reality. There are the navigators. They are navigating the Bardo. These are highly prepared individuals, prepared to travel in the Bardo. They are hooked up, staying connected to whatever it is that we might be connected to while we are hooked up to whatever it is that we might be hooked up to when we are out there, wherever there is. They have pressure gauges, compasses, cameras, headphones, lots of equipment to track the Bardo as skillfully as possible. Some of them have cameras set into the backs of them, and I wish that the last time I was in the Bardo, I had had a camera so that I could have taken photos so that I might do a better job of being in the Bardo the next time. From the navigators came spaceships. I began to wonder, well, do we just float around out there? It would be nice to have spaceships and stations for the navigators to land and rest and to take notes, maybe even set up a library out in the Bardo and prepare for the next round. And then looking out from all of their gear, they see an angel, a Bardo angel, and perhaps there really are guides out there to help us with this. Now, in regard to this process, these are not all images that I have thought up in advance. I know that they can only come about in the doing.
At the memorial service, when I met up with my friend Dee Dee, she cried for me. I couldn't even cry. I was so stunned. And I helped her through hers. But what was interesting is, as artists, we were able to see even deeper into each other by looking at each other's work.
I always felt like there was this disconnect. So you see a lot of this effort of trying to perceive something, trying to get to myself that's disconnected. And then along the way, a really close friend of mine committed suicide. The triptych, that was all about being pulled into the other side and trying to stop myself from going into this dark side.
I remember feeling as though I was going to get pulled so deep under that I was terrified that I wouldn't come back. I wouldn't find my way back.
My husband was killed. I was 45 when that happened. And then my parents died. Then I had a friend who was also an artist, a dear friend, and she was dying of cancer. And I went down and visited her the last time I saw her, and we walked on the beach at Malibu, and we talked about that we wouldn't see each other again. And we talked about our art and our studios and the kids and the whole thing. And then she opened up and expressed to me how sad she was that she was dying in America, because people didn't want to treat her as if she were still alive. And she'd already died in a way for them. And so she was treated very poorly. And I lamented that for a long time after her death, that she had to die twice, in a sense. She had to die socially, from her friends who dropped away, or embarrassed or not knowing what to say to her, because it was so awkward. As you're saying, in this country, death is a pretty awkward event. Like most of my creative process, I just sort of sat and slept and lived with that dilemma of how could I express, how could I influence people to be more open and loving with people who are dying or who have had loved ones die. Mm-hmm. There's actually 16 pieces, and each one is a light box. On the left side, or something about birth, coming into the world, and then on the right side is the opposite end of people being ill, dying, funerals. And somehow, for me, I hope for everyone else too, the two photos work together to form a pair. 30% of the photos are mine, and then the other photos, with hospice's endorsement, we put ads in the newspapers, we were on radio, we were on TV, and people would call in and say, I think I have a photo you might like. And I would take my scanner to like restaurants or people's homes, and they would dig in their wallets. Well, I've never shown this photo to anyone, but I'm willing to share this photo now. It's interesting that when you open a family album, there you'll see birth photos now, and graduations and anniversaries and weddings and proms, but you never see any remembrances from the end of life, which actually in the beginning history of photography was very common. And so it was sort of really hard for people to share these very intimate photos of funerals, and because they thought they were doing something wrong. And then I spoke with a funeral director at a mortuary, and he said that the viewing rooms are littered with little boxes of film, and that people keep it secret, though. My husband's sudden death was a real shift. And that was, my madness, I started folding death certificates into cranes and made 1,000 of those and strung them. And the cranes became art, and traveled to some museums and galleries. Then I showed them maybe 6 years after
making them.
after the original. Right before the opening of that exhibition, I cut one of the cranes in half, and I scotch taped one side on a window and the other side on the outside of the window. And it was a huge, not that I don't miss him every day, but it was a very physical marker for me.
I had to know that he wasn't really there, so I put my face in his ashes.
I was standing in the bathroom, and it was freezing cold, but I didn't care. It was like the cold, it was good to even just feel cold, and I was dripping wet. I was naked. I was standing there. I was brushing my hair, and I kept brushing and brushing and brushing and brushing. And I was going through all these memories of, what did I just do? I just went through this memorial service, and all this stuff is going on, and what did I see there? Did my son die? Is that what really happened? I mean, it was sort of stunning that way. And then after I kind of realized I'd been standing there for a really long time, and I had this brush in my hand, I'm like, okay, and I pulled the hair out of my brush, and I put the brush down, I rolled it into a ball. And I hadn't done that in years, and my grandmother, when I was a kid, would say, take the hairs out of your brush and roll it in a ball, and then put it in the trash can. If they're rolled in a ball, then they won't go all over the place. It won't make a big mess. So I kind of remembered that when I was doing it. I was thinking about her, and she had died, and rolling it, and then I realized, oh, what do I do with it? I'm supposed to throw it I just couldn't throw it in the trash. Somebody would call that OCD, right? Or you can't, couldn't throw it in the trash. So I put it in my drawer. And then every time I brushed my hair, I did that. And I didn't even think about it. It was just something that sort of naturally just started occurring. I gave it very little thought, other than I remembered that my grandmother had shown me how to do that. A few years had passed, and I heard my husband shriek in the bathroom. And I'm like, what's up? And he said, my God, what do you have in your drawer? And I'm like, oh. And he said, never mind. And he knew that I've been sort of processing things this way. He knew I wasn't crazy. And he knew that I was an artist, and that I'm willing to kind of try things or do things. But this was completely unconscious, and I wasn't aware of it until he went, oh my God. So I looked at them, and I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I pulled them all out of the drawer. They were all tucked in between things, and I pulled them all out, and I had a lot. I'm like, that's all my hair. That's 5 years worth of hair. So I strung them all together, and I made this necklace, which I'm going to wear Thursday. I just saw it as this marker where I acknowledged that this is 5 years. I could make a sweater out of this stuff. There's all this hair. Anyways, that's where it came from. It's part of the madness that I see as normal.
I set his clothes on fire. My deeper understanding led me to let it move through me as well. So I literally felt as though I was having a rebirth or an afterbirth or an after death or something. It just started to move. And that was incredible because that's where I started to understand life and I started to become part of the living. He who does not express his grief does not find remedy.
No longer is it enough to ask, what does grief look like? Rather, what am I learning while passing through it? What benefits might possibly emerge from looking at grief directly? One thing that has been beneficial is a developing sense of being conscious, truly present in each moment, a kind of conscious awareness that didn't exist in my life before Jeannie died. Grief will demand it.
One last comment about this process. Probably the finest of all was the final placing of the gold Pieta. Where would we place it?
I like it.
So we tried several places, but nothing was right until we came to the Bardo Angels. There, suddenly, the Bardo Angels took on further meaning. They really seemed to look down upon the Pieta. I could see the same compassion between the Bardo Angels and that Pieta that I could feel when I first saw Michelangelo's Pieta in Rome. In this position together, the process has come around to meet itself. From the first piece I faced into 10 years ago, to these last ones finished only a few weeks ago. And it's the making of my art that has told me this story.
For anybody who goes through grief, you might get to a point where there's this one thing at the end. It's sort of a...
It's the culminating Tea Party celebration
It's
of
the Tea
life.
Party,
Yeah. Yeah, it's the bring me back, anchor, umbilical cord to life.
Yeah.
Which is
And
necessary.
And it's faith that you will come back, you
Yeah.
know, once you've gone. But it's a really long process. I will go to this dark place. I will go. No doubt about it, from time to time. But I'm going to come back. The picture around the corner.
Faith.
Faith. When I go through really dark times, I'll often take that picture and just put it up on my computer screen. And I know how to come back. I know I will come back.
And you won't be empty-handed.
I won't be empty-handed.
That's the key.
It's life, and you see a little plant coming out of the crack in a sidewalk and struggling. That is that creative force, and that's, to me, the same force that motivates me to create something that wasn't there before. That hairball necklace didn't exist until you created it, and I think that's, for me, that's the whole force of the universe. I mean, that's what did all of this,
connected.
you know. Yeah. So it's like breath or like air.
I now understand the importance of breathing and taking it in. Just breathing it all in and exhaling it out. Letting it circulate through you. That's the only way to get at it.